Good morning or afternoon to everyone. I acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. My name is Stephanie Stobbe, and I'm Chair and Associate Professor in Conflict Resolution Studies at Menno Simons College, a college of Canadian Mennonite University. I'll be chairing this morning's session. Thank you for attending this early morning session. It's 6 a.m. in the West Coast, so it's good to be online and great to see you all who are here today. We've had 2 days of great presentations on all the work of MCC throughout the world. This morning's session is on MCC and Peacebuilding. Peacebuilding is important work for building relationships, addressing human rights, and creating social justice in communities and countries around the world. I will introduce each speaker before you present. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to present. I will put a reminder in the chat when you have 2 minutes remaining to wrap up. We will go in the order of the program. After everyone has presented, we will open up the session for a Q&A. Please think of short questions and comments related to the presentations you would like to share in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen and not in the general chat, and asking for a mic to ask a question. Also indicate who you would like to address the question to at the beginning of the question. And those of you who are in the audience, feel free to introduce yourselves to others at the conference in the chat. Our first speaker is Eliakim or Kim Sibanda, who is Professor of History at the University of Winnipeg and Head of Graduate Studies in the Joint Peace and Conflict Studies program at University of Winnipeg and University of Manitoba. His areas of expertise include African liberation movement, history of agrarian policies, migration and migrant labor history of Southern Africa, and ethnicity, race, gender, and class in 20th Southern Africa. He has numerous publications, including the Zimbabwe African People's Union, 1961 to 1987, A Political History of Insurgency in Southern Rhodesia. His presentation is titled MCC, the Brethren in Christ and Social Concern in Post-Colonial Zimbabwe. Welcome, Kim. Kim, you're muted.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you very much for listening to my presentation this morning. I am originally from Zimbabwe, and perhaps hence my topic. And I'll be speaking on the topic entitled MCC, the Brethren in Christ Church, and Social Concern in Post-Colonial Zimbabwe. I would want to preface my presentation by saying there is a lack of scholarly written material on the operation of the MCC, or the Mennonite Central Service Committee in Zimbabwe. This might be a function of the fact that the organization does not fall directly under the Brethren in Christ administration. The organization with which it partners in Zimbabwe. Its relationship with the Brethren in Christ is both formal and informal and informal. At a formal level, the BIC, or the Brethren in Christ Church, which I will be referring to, the BICC, assists members of the Mennonite Central MCC, in this case, in the country, representatives with immigration papers through its members who have positions of power in government. As well, BIC pastors and members help in hosting young people from North America or sending young people from Zimbabwe participating in exchange programs such as the international volunteer programs and the young Anabaptist Mennonite exchange programs and so on. Institutionally, both the MCC and PIC partner with the Mennonite World Conference, a worldwide fellowship of Anabaptist churches formed in 1925, only 5 years after the founding of the MCC. Although the supervision of country representatives across Africa is done by 2 area directors based in Africa as well, the ultimate authority rests with North American offices under the leadership of Ruth Clemens in the US and Mark Ebb here in Canada. As a result, little information, if at all, could be found or can be found in the BICC church archives or any other scholarly publication that has been produced by locals themselves. So what I'm trying to say here is that most of the information of a scholarly nature that can be accessed and used for research purposes can be found on the overseas. And what we have largely we are using, especially in Zimbabwe, more specifically in Zambia, the places I'm familiar with, is what has been written outside. So for someone to do good research, they will then have to deal with overseas offices. However, there is some anecdotal information that can be found by talking with people who have either worked for MCC or have been sponsored by AMCC as perhaps teachers and also working in hospitals and in some other areas. And just after independence, largely after country representatives who are based in some of these countries. According to Ruth Clemens, one of the 2 international program directors here in North America, MCC has been in Africa for more than actually 5 decades. It started its work in post-colonial Congo, today known as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in 1960. We may just remember some of us may know that 1960 was known as the year of Africa because 17 countries earned their independence in that year. So the ANC sent its high school teachers under its Teachers Abroad program, known short as TAP, to many of these newly independent countries to assist in teaching at their schools, along with the PACS program, where young men helped with agriculture and food security programs. Again, according to Ruth Clemens, MCC's early days in Africa were when the first PACS men were sent to the DR Congo, or Democratic Republic of Congo, to help build schools, mission stations, hospitals, churches in the mid-1950s. And both of these groups chose to do alternative service to war and were, of course, sent to Africa to save their time there. In colonial Zimbabwe, anecdotal evidence suggests MCC started in the 1960s as well. And according to this anecdotal evidence, the MCC sent both PACS and the TAP personnel at the invitation of missionaries who wanted assistance with teaching at high schools, building schools, hospitals, building dams, working farms and bookstores, and in maintaining mission stations. And this is in contrast with what happened, according also here, if I may quote Ruth, in the Congo, where these Webhacks people and also the TEP people went down there at the invitation of the government and also across some of the African countries in the African continent to assist in teaching at schools and also running missions and hospitals there. So Mennonite personnel were equally active in teaching about non-violence and non-resistance in the country that was already embroiled, that is in Zimbabwe, in conflict with many of these BICC members and even some pastors in political detention for standing for justice. This was starting from the 1960s into the 1970s. By the way, Zimbabwe was involved in an intense liberation struggle or armed conflict for 15 years from 1965 and on, up to 1980 when it became independent. This was one of the bonds, of course. I mean, the preaching of non-violence and non-resistance was one of the bonds of contention between Black Africans and Mennonite personnel that preached nonviolence, but were not seen as championing social justice. This in no way shouldn't be understood as suggesting that BICC members didn't believe in nonviolence, but rather that they were not happy with the fact that nonviolence was only taught to them and not to the white population, which was considered to be violent and unjust by the African population. MCC was no exception in avoiding politics in such contexts, at a cost of being misunderstood sometimes, of course. Christian Protestants and evangelicals in general throughout the world have had a practice of shirking from involvement in politics. It is a point in which they have perhaps correctly been criticized by those who argue that unjust political structures must be challenged if there is to be social justice and peace in this world. In post-colonial Zimbabwe, MCC got more deeply involved in its partnering with the BICC in several projects. These included, among other things, food security and sustainable livelihood projects. Together with the Brethren in Christ Church, the MCC partners with another organization, the Economical Church Leaders Forum, in working with 2,500 farmers on conservation agriculture and in peace building initiatives. These are farmers that have been adversely affected by climate change, and they also help with the building of the infrastructure or maintaining it there. The shift could be attributed to two events, which I may talk about perhaps during the Q&A session, if needs be. The change two actually, which were prompted by Zimbabwe being independent. That was the appointment of country representatives from the continent itself. This helped bridge the gap in the general knowledge of Zimbabwe's religious, political, and social systems, and avoided in this situation the sending of personnel there who were not perhaps qualified to undertake some of the things that were required by the country, or the partners over there. A good example is that of, for instance, those who went to teach in secondary schools in the 70s and into the 90s, sponsored by the church. So the Rhodesia then, or Zimbabwe, came to be Zimbabwe, educational system was a British one, where high scholars wrote Cambridge examinations or the London certificate examinations. So the training was basically very different. So that people who came from North America and also Australia found themselves considered as not being qualified to teach in some of the secondary schools because of those requirements. For instance, if you were to teach and you had a degree, you were only considered academically qualified, but not professionally qualified. So you needed to have a diploma in teaching in order to be considered as qualified as a teacher. These are some of the things which I'm talking about when I talk about some mismatch. The second one was the push by the new government, which correlated religious issues with dialectical materialism. This was something that was taught right around the country. And some of the people were involved in those who taught on the pedagogy of the oppressed Bavaria were the Lutheran World Federation. So it really kind of directed some of the development in the country. And so NGOs got more involved in the participation and also sponsoring some of those programs. So the work of the MCC in Zimbabwe over the past 5 decades has actually, in conclusion, just to conclude quickly here, yielded a mixed bag of results. To its strength, it has immensely contributed in the development of VIC, mission schools, hospitals, farms, dams, and also you're talking about peace, where there has also been a shift from talking more about social justice in some of the seminars that we're seeing, of course, from the Christian perspective, than dwelling more on nonviolence and non-resistance. However, it has been found, as you can tell from this, very wanting in issues of social justice by not challenging unjust political structures that had or have had a pernicious effect on the lives of people among whom it is serving. First, during the colonial times, and second, during the post-colonial times, when the ruling party in Zimbabwe sent its troops to Matabeleland, which of course is dominantly the end brother in Christ, actually killing and maiming at least more than 20,000 people within a span of 3 years. I think I will end here, and we'll take some questions, of course, when my turn comes.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim, for your presentation on MCC's work in Zimbabwe. And we will, at the end, have some questions and comments about that. Our second presenter is Grace Hercyk, and she is the Peacebuilding Coordinator at Mennonite Central Committee, where she supports MCC's international peacebuilding work. She holds an MA from Eastern Mennonite University in conflict transformation and has worked abroad on peacebuilding issues. She's currently based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the United States. And her presentation is titled, Evaluating MCC's Supportive Peace Institutes and Advanced Peace Education in South Africa, the Philippines, Burundi, and beyond. Welcome, Grace.
Thanks so much. Let me prepare my PowerPoint, if indeed I can do that. So yes, thank you so much for sharing this time with me. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you for taking time in your busy day for this presentation, for this conference. It is Saturday morning for many people, so I definitely appreciate your time. I'm honored to be speaking on this panel, and I'm really excited for all the other presentations we'll be hearing this morning. So as has already been shared, my name is Grace. I work for MCC US as the Global Peacebuilding Coordinator, and I primarily work with our international programming. I'm based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, from where I'm calling this morning. And I'd like to acknowledge this is the traditional homeland of the Lenape and the Delaware nations. So as part of my presentation, as part of my role, which leads to this presentation, is I often look at more in-depth at sectoral questions of interest for MCC and our peacebuilding work. So I will be sharing this morning about a study that I did in 2019, looking into advanced peace education and primarily our work with peace institutes. And I will acknowledge my presentation is more in the vein of an evaluation and an internal evaluation than a purely academic paper, but I still think it does have some value. So as a bit of a background, MCC has long supported expanding key peacebuilding knowledge within our staff and our partners and other stakeholders. So for many of our partners, particularly in the early days of peacebuilding abroad, there may have been some knowledge of peacebuilding, there may have been some seminars or books, etc. But it was considered important to deepen that knowledge in our peacebuilding partners in order to allow them to do their work better and to pursue MCC's vision of a justice-based peace. And also it's very much connected to our Anabaptist Peace Church roots and our peace theology. So more in-depth knowledge was considered to be very important to deepen the abilities of our staff and our partners globally. The primary tool for the last 20 years utilized to achieve this goal was peace institutes. So continuing the background a bit, the Summer Peacebuilding Institute at Eastern Mennonite University provided an excellent and very inspirational model for how to do this. So it was very, very innovative when it started around 1994. And of course, there are many MCC connections to EMU and to CJP, which would make another very excellent presentation. SPI started by offering courses that were around 5 to 7 days long on key peacebuilding topics. They tended to be co-taught by a practitioner and an academic, and each summer would offer between 3 and 6 weeks of courses. Often several courses were offered each week. It was primarily attended residentially, and courses would vary from introductory to very advanced, with some variation year to year based on interest. So SPI proved extremely popular, and it was particularly prized because it was a very diverse group of attendees. People would come from all over the world. And the fellowship and the networking that were provided were considered to be a really important element of this Peace Institute experience. So MCC sponsored large numbers of participants to attend over the years. Many alumni went home to start their own Peace Institutes based on this model tailored to their own context and using instructors and wisdom relevant to their context. MCC helped with seed funding for many of these institutes and sent participants to these institutes. So this remained for the better part of 2 decades the preferred and most frequently used way to increase peacebuilding expertise within MCC and its partner organizations, particularly in international programs. So when I was an undergraduate student at EMU in 2009, I worked for Summer Peacebuilding Institute for a summer as the housing coordinator. So you can see this extremely low resolution photo of me at a much younger time. And I later attended SPI as a participant as part of my graduate education in 2014. And I can remember meeting MCC-sponsored participants on both occasions. I will not make you absorb this full list, but these are the peace institutes that were considered as part of this study. One now in Zimbabwe, it was previously in South Africa and Zambia. Canadian School of Peacebuilding will be familiar to many of you. One in North Carolina, one now in Kenya, Could Burundi, Chennai, India, Philippines, 2 that rotate in Northeast Asia and various places, Nigeria, and of course, the original one, the SPI. There are many peace institutes around the world, but these are the ones that more or less operate in the MCC sphere, particularly in the last 5 years. And they were the ones that were considered as part of this study. And I very much enjoyed our presentation last night on MCC as an incubator. I think it's fair to understand many of these peace institutes as part of that that framework, as MCC did help start many of these. The key questions I was interested in this study was how recipients assess their experience, apply their education afterward, and also to consider how MCC can strengthen the provision of advanced peace education to staff and partners, be it in the PI model or other models. So yeah, the questions here are summarizing, how have people experience it? How do they find it? How do they consider this the travel to an international context versus a provision of education in country? And how should MCC think about it further? The methods I used for my study were a combination. So I did a survey, which I did around spring 2019. I contacted all of MCC's country programs and asked for a list of anyone they had sent to a PI or sponsored for a PI in the last 5 years. The 5 years is roughly the sort of time folks often serve with MCC abroad. I received a long list of names and ended up with 84 respondents. The survey was offered in English, French, and Spanish to be inclusive of the many different countries and languages where we work. I also conducted interviews with folks who had attended a Peace Institute who wanted to explain their experience or their learning further, and also the leadership of different Peace Institutes. And finally, I attended 5 of the Peace Institutes that MCC supports as a participant in 2019. So in 2019, I was in Uganda, the Philippines, South Africa, Nigeria, and Burundi, which I was very grateful for that experience and offered a lot of insight. The common threads across all the Peace Institutes they tend to have a fairly similar model. So they are modeled after that original SPI model. They tend to be residential, 1-week courses, often 2 to 3 tracks are offered per week, different course offerings, and very much prizing a very diverse participant cohort, as well as very diverse trainers and teachers. They very much prioritize a very contextual practice focus. So most folks are very clear this is not an academic experience. This is where you come to learn skills and to practice things, finding instructors who have a lot of practice in the field. And finally, they don't tend to have a lot of additional programming. The annual training tends to be the main product or service offered. Most would like to do more, and many participants would like if more was offered. And there are some exceptions. There are some Peace Institutes that do a little bit more and are able to do a little bit more throughout the year. But generally the landscape is pretty limited. So the key findings, I will go over a little, hopefully not too briefly, but briefly. There are 6 themes that stood out in the study, and I will go through them next. So overall, I found widespread support from all the alumni who attended a Peace Institute. Just off the charts, extremely high support across every dimension. Participants loved their PI experience. Around 95% said they would do it over again or recommend it to others. No one really had any consistent regrets or criticisms or things they would change. Although, of course, there were critiques about the food and the accommodations, which do tend to be on the humbler side. While many folks may be apt to respond positively to us as a donor organization and to me as the researcher, having attended 5 PIs in the year and having engaged with a lot of people, I think there is genuinely a lot of support. So maybe 95% support is high, but there is definitely high support. I think it's also fair to note that a lot of the Peace Institutes have been running for very many years, upwards of 15 years. So a lot of the kinks have been ironed out of the actual running of the Institute. So it does seem very streamlined for all the participants. The second finding that I thought was very interesting and I was not necessarily expecting was, of course, we're very interested in how are folks applying the knowledge they learned after this PI experience. And I received a lot of very interesting responses. So folks were allowed to, it was a very open-ended question, like how have you applied the information you learned? And often folks would provide several examples. So I coded this in terms of there were 75 examples of how folks have used the information they learned in a professional setting. There were 16 examples of how folks have used this information in a home, community, or personal setting. And then there were another 15 examples of what I coded as general use. So folks answering things like, I'm a better listener, I now view the world through a nonviolent lens, or something in this nature, which could be applied to both the professional and the personal setting. This was very exciting for us as MCC, as we are, of course, hopeful that folks have applied their information, and it seems that they have. Every single respondent had an example of how they had applied the content. Another very interesting part of this was the extent to which folks would often list new values as a very significant takeaway from their PI experience. This is interesting to me, as we often think of PI as a sort of a knowledge transfer mechanism. You go and you learn how to be a mediator in 8 steps or whatnot. Yet for many participants, this was an introduction to a new paradigm, a new way of thinking in the world, a way to view the world through the lens of positive peace or nonviolence or peace theology. This was also confirmed in interviews as a really important outcome for a lot of people. So to me, this is interesting, as it helps us, knowing this helps us adjust our expectations of what we might expect from a Peace Institute experience or how we might run a Peace Institute. So if values are the most meaningful takeaway, how can we structure this month-long experience to really maximize that? Are we comfortable with this outcome, or would we prefer to have a more purely knowledge transfer experience? So these are questions for me and the leadership of Peace Institute to think more about. The second 2 themes of 6 themes, so the Africa Peace Institute. So MCC supports 4 Peace Institutes on the continent, so this finding was specific to them. They each serve a role in their respective spaces, but there is a good bit of overlap in topics and instructors. They also tend to operate slightly independent from the context. They are very much international gatherings, and while many offer field trips, etc., and do have local trainers, they don't tend to engage too much with the issues or the context in which they're operating. So this is consistent with how the SPI model was originated, which is a very international gathering that has very limited interaction with Virginia or the US writ large, at least in its original model. It has changed a bit since then. So this is maybe not a surprising finding, but it arguably could be a lost opportunity for peace builders who travel to Burundi and yet engage not very deeply with the Burundian peace and justice context. So these findings are relevant to our peace institutes in Africa and their leadership of the peace institutes themselves to further dialogue and determine a better way forward, specifically for carving out a clearer niche for each peace institute. The next finding was around alumni. So we have always hoped at MCC, prayerfully so, that participants are staying in touch with each other afterwards. We really do consider this networking element to be a very valuable secondary benefit of sending someone to a peace institute. And this study confirmed that folks are staying in touch with other alumni. Of course, the quality would be an excellent follow-up study, but it does confirm that folks are staying in touch. Most participants would be happy to continue also engaging with the Peace Institute, and this was unprompted. This just came up quite often, is that alumni would like to do more with the Peace Institute if that was an option. While several of the PIs do have slightly more developed mechanisms for follow-up and staying in touch, some have newsletters, others offer small in-country gatherings and various smaller things. Most PIs don't have the staffing or the resources to do more programming, but there's certainly appetite and interest from alumni, and if that was an option, so that is something for us to consider further as well. The last 2 themes were around education in country versus education abroad. So the question of travel, environmental impact, and the high cost associated with sending someone to a Peace Institute has been a lingering question within the MCC system, and was a question that I heard when I started my role 3 years ago. There are many additional stresses and concerns over leaving, for folks who attend a PI, leaving one's home, one's work, one's family for a whole month to attend a Peace Institute has very exclusionary impact on many people, particularly people who have a lot of caregiving responsibilities or are senior leadership in an organization. They just cannot take all that time off, or they do, and it's an extremely high burden. There is also the assumption that for many, travel to an international context was sort of the bonus of attending a Peace Institute. So this is why this question was explored a little further in both the survey and the interviews. And it was revealed that for some contexts, there really is no comparable opportunity in country. So going to a PI was kind of the only option, or this was assessed to be the only option. And others mentioned in interviews that maybe there were more opportunities at home that just hadn't been fully explored at this stage. So this was also an interesting finding. but there was little evidence to suggest that international travel was either necessary or a strong selling point of the Peace Institute experience. So I will note that at the time of this research, this was May through November 2019, so there was not interest in online options when presented as a possibly more flexible option, but mostly because folks were concerned that wouldn't allow the networking component that is considered very important. So it was a bit of a binary in terms of do you go or do you stay? So in summary, it's both complex and very nuanced. There's openness to less travel for more opportunities at home, interest in having options at home, but also an acknowledgement that maybe it won't be the same if there wasn't that travel component. Which ties a bit into my next and final point, which is expanding alternatives and complementary approaches. So while Peace Institutes are the main approach taken to increasing advanced peacebuilding knowledge, 3 other options were identified in my research. So in Ukraine, the MCC program took their peace and justice partners to Palestine for a week-long exchange to focus on learning together about peace and justice issues in each other's contexts. In Latin and South America, there's been a tradition of bringing partners together every couple of years for more of a co-learning session. And sometimes they do bring in a speaker as well for that more knowledge component. And there are various examples of bringing a trainer to a context. So Ukraine has also brought trainers in the past from the Balkan region who have provided training to their staff and partners in country, feeling that this was a better cultural and contextual fit than sending someone to a peace institute in another country. And there was also at least one other noted example of sending a trainer from SPI to a country program to do training in country. So in 2019, when I did this study, among the respondents that I engaged with, there was not a significant appetite for alternative models. There was a preference to continue the PI model as much as possible. But in engaging people in interviews and in additional conversations, there was an acknowledgement that, maybe depending on the context, one of these other approaches might be a good fit, and they were worth considering at times. So more generally, my own takeaway was that while we have a lot of respect for how the Peace Institute model has held up over time, and this study is evidence of that, also wanting to emphasize that PIs are not the only tool in our toolbox. The peacebuilding field has changed a lot since when SPI began many years ago in the early 90s. We have a lot more technological options. The global baseline level of peacebuilding knowledge has increased. Peacebuilding is no longer sort of a strange idea. There are a lot more resources, there are a lot more books, and a lot more resources, particularly outside of North America. It would be expected that the context might change a bit, and encouraging folks to ask themselves what makes the most sense for your context, what are the peace knowledge gaps in your context, and what tool or approach might be best fit to close those gaps. So in summary and conclusion, feeling very grateful that overall, learning that this model has served us well. We are very happy in many ways with how it has increased knowledge for many of our staff and partners over the years. The study confirmed that it has been very a good fit for a lot of contexts. And this confirmation was appreciated across the MCC system when I shared these results last April. There are also many opportunities for additional study and follow-up, which I would warmly welcome. This was certainly just skimming the top of this very complex topic, and I would be very happy to have additional study, and maybe I at one point will do additional study about how we can think more about this more deeply. And this study also leaves us food for thought. As the next 100 years unfold for MCC, we will likely continue providing and promoting advanced peace education to our staff and partners. My hope is that this study will widen the menu of possibilities. PIs in their classic form will likely always have a place. There are many benefits to them, and they are a deeply loved model. But there are also maybe other benefits over the next 100 years, more local opportunities, more online opportunities. And of course, I think that maybe in the 2070s, there might even be such a thing as a virtual reality opportunity. And since I finished this study, I've been very pleased to see how almost all the Peace Institutes have offered an online option over the last year and a half, and many have gone very, very well and have already started to widen the possibilities of what might be possible for folks. So as an MCCer and as a peace builder, I look forward to the next 100 years of peace building opportunities and I hope that this study will be useful in helping us shape what comes next. So thank you for your time. I look forward to the other speakers, and I look forward to further engagement in the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Grace, for your presentation and sharing with us your research on peace institutes around the world and MCC's involvement in them. So our third speaker is Jodi Dueck-Read, pronoun she, her, is an assistant professor of conflict resolution studies and director of practicum at Menno Simons College of Canadian Mennonite University. She completed her master's in conflict transformation and peacebuilding from the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University, and her PhD in peace and conflict studies from the University of Manitoba. For 12 years, she worked in various assignments with Mennonite Central Committee in Bolivia, Chile, and at the US-Mexico border. She has conducted program evaluation for MCC, more recently in Bolivia in 2017 and Guatemala in 2019, and served on the local committee of MCC Peace and Justice work in Manitoba. Jodi lives with her wife and son in Winnipeg, and her presentation is called Queering Mennonite Peacebuilding. Welcome, Jodi.
Thank you, Stephanie. Sorry for the delay there. Really glad to be with you all today. Let me just get started here. So again, good morning. Since I began dreaming about this project and submitted my abstract for the conference a few years ago, I have narrowed its scope. Instead of providing an anti-racist and history of pro-queer initiatives within MCC, I am focusing instead on situating the benefits of queer theoretical contributions to a trajectory of Mennonite peacebuilding, putting the focus for this presentation on potentialities. I approached this paper and the proposition of queer Mennonite peacebuilding with years of service with MCC as a person who's led some program evaluations as assistant professor of conflict resolution studies and peacebuilding at Canadian Mennonite University, and notably as a queer, white, feminist scholar. And despite my currently hyphenated Mennonite last name, my integration with Mennonite faith, education, and peace work has occurred in my adult years. My first immersion with MCC was in Akron, Pennsylvania, and then Santa Cruz, Bolivia in 1996. And each of my positions influences my reading of Mennonite theology and experiences with Mennonite peacebuilding. I also wish to dispel any notions of being a scholar of Mennonites. I enter this field with trepidation and much respect for Mennonite historians and scholars. If you have read about queer Mennonites from a Dueck-Read, that's my partner Alicia, not me. Before I delve into my suggestion to queer Mennonite peacebuilding, I want to discuss some key characteristics of historical and contemporary MCC peacebuilding efforts. Since MCC's inception, MCC peace workers have sought to listen to people who are suffering, people who are hungry, people dispossessed of their land and possessions, and people experiencing structural and direct violence. While MCC workers have listened, they have also struggled internally and externally with notions of systemic and interpersonal power. In some cases, workers have come to understand and contend with their racial, gender, and material power while working and living in a system that favors the cisgender male body with white skin. In other cases, reflection and action to accompany such privileges has remained intangible. Power also comes into play when considering what Mennonites name as violence. Mennonite peacebuilding over the years has come to expand its notion of violence, resulting in programs to address unfolding areas of concern. There are, however, some types of violence that MCC is uncomfortable naming. Mennonite peacebuilders and scholars who spent years shaping MCC's approach to peace have championed courageous relational peacebuilding. Such giants in the field have encouraged MCC not to fear working with representatives of the military, have helped shape practices that encourage peace workers to take care of themselves, and provided the frames and impetus to build peace strategically. MCC's peace-building actions have been lauded and critiqued from the inside and the outside. From the margins, I offer this proposition to queer Mennonite peacebuilding, overturning MCC's 100-year maintenance of a policy which excludes the contributions of nonviolent practitioners who are committed two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer, or 2S LGBTQ Christians, and to develop queer and subversive relationships where interpersonal power is understood and used to break down systemic inequities. Let me move now to explore some of the history of MCC peacemaking ventures. When peacemaking emerged as a central focus for MCC, male conscientious objectors were front and center. Men needed to have a location and means to do their alternative service. In some country, MCC and Mennonites more generally advocated to the government for conscientious objector status. In other places, MCC shaped programs for service, such as the PAX program, which Kim mentioned this morning. These service opportunities kept some Mennonite men out of war and led some to discover new career possibilities. Mennonite women also want to live out their conscientious objections, convictions, and commitment to nonviolence. Marlene Epp indicates that Mennonite women did not always know how they could contribute to non-resistance. The same programs were not in place for women. MCC did support an array of sewing circles, thrift shops, the creation of a cooperative for artisans to sell their crafts in North America, better known as 10,000 Villages, and many other relief efforts spearheaded by women. As MCC's commitment to peace unfolded, MCC workers also began to listen to the encouragement and redirection espoused by relief recipients. Relief recipients encouraged MCC to advocate for significant changes to the foreign policy pursuits of their North American governments, specifically the governments of the United States and Canada. MCC listened and then created advocacy units in Washington, DC and Ottawa, Ontario. Furthermore, MCC also started US-based and international programs to develop mediation and facilitation work locally and overseas. MCC's Peace Witness grew as it educated North American constituency about peace, the importance of standing nonviolently against war machines, and began to delve into other peace issues locally and globally. Yet throughout this expansion of services, programs, and education and peace, MCC workers have struggled to understand their interpersonal realities of systemic power, especially the influence of whiteness. In North America and many parts of the world, white people have created systems that favor them to the detriment of racialized others. This results in the emergence in everyday realities of white supremacy. Institutional white supremacy keeps white people in control and in leadership. Tobin Miller-Scherer, former MCC worker and a white male, worked in the area of anti-racism in MCC. In his service and in his ongoing scholarly work, he continually implores white Mennonites to acknowledge their power. He pleads for white Mennonites to listen to the voices of Black people and other people of color, recognizing that what people of color want is often not the route that white Mennonites take. Miller-Scherer reminds Mennonites of the weighty 1967 invitation of Vincent Harding, a Black civil rights leader who determinedly invited Mennonites to examine their power. White people listen selectively and do not consistently put people of color at the forefront. The call for recognizing and understanding the power of whiteness comes from many directions. Carl Stauffer, a white male Mennonite peace builder and a scholar, also clearly advocates that Mennonites learn to recognize and understand their power. Lucille Marr, a Canadian scholar, asserts that a more complete history of MCC needs to draw from those with less power. She emphasizes a need to look at the ways that MCC's work is oppressive in terms of gender, class, race, and colonial power. Melanie Campen, looking at the context of power in relation to indigenous people in North America, says that white settler Mennonites have not considered the ways they wield social power in interactions with indigenous people. Campen goes on to offer a clear critique of Mennonites on peace-building journeys with indigenous people. She contends that without acknowledging Mennonite involvement in operating residential schools, we cannot move forward. Truth requires that we study harm, know our part in it, and see how these experiences continue to inform our understanding of Mennonites as innocent of committing or entangled in many types of colonial violence. The struggle to disavow the power of whiteness and other identities of privilege and change structures to favor those who are currently disadvantaged also speaks into MCC's expanding definitions of violence. As MCC names certain injustices as violence, their peace witness grew outwardly and inwardly. When MCC recognized colonial violence against Indigenous people in Canada and the US, they created Native Concerns, now called Indigenous Neighbors. When MCC saw that Mennonite women and others were harmed in the home, they opened a program called Women's Concerns. It seems that once MCC is able to name or comprehend violence against a group of people, they open doors for peace-building work. However, there are other types of violence, especially those of a sexualized nature, that are not named. Stephanie Crable, in her study of LGBTQ justice in Mennonite Church USA, indicates that Mennonite ways of explaining and understanding violence are troubled. She contends that, quote, Mennonite conflicts over LGBTQ inclusion are also struggles over how violence should be defined, end quote. What happens when you call exclusion violence? Further, she invites Mennonites to see the harm of discernment processes and contends that such processes can and do hurt LGBTQ people and their families. Crable suggests that Mennonites come to a realization of the harm of process. Kathy Evans, a queer restorative justice scholar at Eastern Mennonite University, invites Mennonite peace builders and churches to make rooms for queer folks, to consider the ways that exclusion has harmed not just LGBTQ folks, but their families, the pastors and churches that have been kicked out of conferences, and those who have yet to come out. She advocates seeing the harm of exclusion on the continuum of violence. Carl Stauffer suggests an evident connection between unexamined power and violence that emerges from a lack of analysis. He says, and I quote, if we as Mennonites desire to genuinely engage the injustices surrounding us, we will be required to take stock of our agency, both personal and structural, in misusing and abusing our dominant power positions in race, gender, class, and religion, resulting in the exploitation and oppression of others, end quote. I would add sexual orientation to the list. Thus, like Mennonite Church USA that Crable studied, MCC responds to some kinds of violence with which it is comfortable naming while leaving others unattended. The exclusion of the voices, perspectives, suffering, and contributions of racialized persons and queer people leaves many without MCC solidarity or care, makes MCC's peace-building practices and teaching less robust, and continues the violence of exclusion. Next, in my paper, I provide a grounding in the gendered and heterosexist framing of mainstream peace-building scholarship. But instead here, I propose to move to consider the contributions of queer Mennonite scholars. Queer Mennonite scholars provide direction to queer Mennonite peacebuilding. Queer Mennonite novelist Jan Braun in 2014 invited Mennonites to queer marriage by, and I quote, returning to the value of ritual as an antidote to the ways in which capitalism has taught us to devalue marriage, end quote. Furthermore, she invites us to, quote, break up binaries and be reminded of a wider field of experience, need, thought, belief, and possibilities, which she says open hopeful possibilities. In Alicia Dueck-Read's 2015 study of transgender and gender nonconforming Mennonites, she suggests a reconsideration of Mennonite identity, a movement to open space for non-cisgender and non-heterosexual people, for the array of us Mennonite families and institutions who struggle to maintain a connection to Mennonites given our non-compliant gender and sexual identities. Daniel Schenk Cruz, who examines queer Mennonite literature, invites us to think about the activism of queer theory, to be disquieted by the oppression that queer Mennonite literature makes apparent, and to adopt analyses of power relationships that queer theory suggests. Most recently, Stephanie Chandler Burns suggests that queering Anabaptist theology could offer a revitalization to Anabaptist ways of understanding and relating to God, and also address binary thinking to take a fresh look at oppression of race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, disability, and socioeconomic status, among many inequalities. In Rachel Gooson's 2021 multi-year study of queer Mennonite leaders, one of her respondents, Annabeth Roshley, contends that we must queer justice. Roshley's quote unearths the demand to change systems and structures that are obscuring justice for people with identities that are categorized, policed, and excluded, that of racialized, disabled, and queer Mennonites, to name a few. Thus, the invitation into a new way of examining and working with power does not solely benefit queer bodies. Queer theory proposes to deconstruct the normative and disrupt binary ways of thinking. I like to think of queer theory as messing with hierarchies and expectations. Queer theory opens possibilities. Queering norms by untangling them with categories is part of the application of queer theory. Queer theory says that identity is not fixed. In essence, employing queer theory means getting rid of binaries, recognizing and affirming the shifting and movement of identities. And in queer theory, one may find the liberation to be who they are. The idea to queer Mennonite peacebuilding is not an aberration. It draws from the well of Mennonite reflection, of concentrated efforts by Mennonites to listen in the field. It resituates listening and invites deep attending to people that MCC, by way of policy, has marginalized. Jana Hunter Bowman, in writing about the origins of the theology and practice of Mennonite peacebuilder John Paul Lederach, indicates that Lederach dealt with power differentials by embracing humility, listening to others, and not being assured that he knew the answers. Queer Mennonite peacebuilding does not purport to find all the answers, but seeks to understand how the power of categories makes some people invisible or less worthy, and invites peace people to recognize that there is more to situations of violence experienced by gender and sexually diverse people. Queer Mennonite peacebuilding is also a type of subversive engagement, a messing up of the assumed and presumed nature of relationships. Stauffer, who suggests Mennonite peacebuilding be subversive engagement, describes the entailing unusual relationships in such an arrangement. He suggests that Mennonite peacebuilding seek to both work within a friendly relationship with government, with a recognition of the privileges given by such a relationship, while not losing sight of the discrepancies or messiness in advocating for changes to a government that privileges certain bodies over others. In sum, queer Mennonite peacebuilding builds on MCC's history of listening to the voices of marginalized people. Whether they are queer, racialized, or disabled, they are not excluded because of a category. Queer Mennonite peacebuilding may also reconceptualize courageous peacebuilding, and furthermore works to name racialized and sexualized violence within Mennonite institutions and community life. The work of queer Mennonite peacebuilding is to name, to examine, and to respond to the power of violence in the systems and structures of society and within our homes, communities, churches, and NGOs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jodi, for your presentation on listening to marginalized people and queer Mennonites. And we'll have some more time to discuss that later on in the session. So our fourth presenter is Patricia Harms. She is a Latin American historian focusing specifically on Guatemala. Her work has focused on women's histories in Guatemala City, as well as the transnational movements in which they were involved. Ladina's social activism in Guatemala City, 1871 to 1954, was published in 2020 by University of New Mexico Press and has received several awards subsequently. She is currently involved in several Hercyk-funded projects with island lake communities in northern Manitoba, as well as continued research on women and gender in Central America. Her paper is titled Recovering the Roots of Anabaptism, MCC and the Rejuvenation of Radical Discipleship in Guatemala. Patricia.
All right. Is this, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm coming to you from the boundaries of Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 territories, traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Assiniboine, and Cree, and represents the heart of the Métis Nation. My house and office are powered by hydroelectricity taken from Treaty 5 lands. I've changed my title a little bit, and it's this presentation is called Sharing a Vision of Shalom, MCC Guatemala as a Vehicle of Transformation. MCC entered Guatemala at a pivotal moment in its history. A devastating earthquake in 1976 brought the Mennonite Disaster Service into the country, after which MCC established a permanent presence in 1978. Just as the country was teetering on the cusp of a resurgent civil war. The ideals and values of MCC placed them into direct conflict with an entrenched socioeconomic political system that had systematically disenfranchised the majority of Guatemalans since the conquest of 1524, over half of who identified as an indigenous Maya. Violence permeates all elements of society as state-sponsored terror targeted anyone perceived to be a threat to their power. As Guatemalan Mennonites struggled to navigate this politically precarious terrain through a 16th century Reformation to understand their context. Consequently, they developed a vision of shalom that defined peace not as the absence of violence, but an active peacemaking stance in all elements of their lives. MCC supported and facilitated this Anabaptist resurgence, in the process becoming the transnational conduit through which this theological transformation was communicated regionally across Central America, and most critically back to its North American constituents. Stories of struggle and hope became the instrument through which MCC navigated the politically polarized Cold War world, revealing the complicity of North Americans in Guatemala's severe political and economic violence, as well as our complicity in the possibility of transformation. In the early morning hours of February 4th, 1976, the most destructive earthquake in Central American history struck just 54 kilometers from Guatemala City in the state of Chimaltenango. It remains unparalleled in its destruction of people and property. The initial earthquake, along with two powerful aftershocks, killed more than 22,000 people, in large part due to its occurrence in the middle of the night when most people were asleep in their homes. Many died in their beds as their adobe structures disintegrated on top of them under tectonic forces. More than 74,000 additional people were wounded, and more than 1 million people were displaced. Meanwhile, wealthy Guatemalans kept appointments to have their dogs groomed and ordered the latest cocktail known as the terremoto, or the earthquake. This apparent lack of empathy on part of the wealthy, as well as the earthquake's disproportionate destructive effect on the poor, caused many analysts to rename the tragedy a class quake. The Mennonite Disaster Service response revealed the intense social and economic needs of Guatemalans, concluding that a natural disaster may be a good toehold for development activities. It forces change. People work together in new ways. This opens the way for a problem-solving educational approach from the beginning. MCC began its work focused on relief and housing construction following the extensive damage caused by the earthquake. However, the severe institutional poverty also quickly drew the attention of MCC's first director, Jorge Reimer, whose genius and savvy launched the Appropriate Technology Program. The AT program drew MCC into rural and indigenous Guatemala, exposing them to the historic land inequity. 70% of the land was owned by 2% of the population, as well as structural racism, and then ultimately the genocidal levels of violence directed at indigenous communities during the 1980s. The MCC personnel that engaged with these projects brought with them crucial skills and funding, but also became transformed by their relationships with Spanish-speaking, Kekchi, Quiche, and Ixil Guatemalans as they struggled with cultural norms and developing a sense of empowerment within communities historically disempowered by repressive and colonial governments. Many of these early initiatives were designed to address the extraordinary workload rural women had and to reduce their expenses for things like firewood. The AT philosophy of self-reliance and Christian responsibility came into direct conflict with Guatemala's socio-political climate. The program itself became the target of military attacks, and travel often was dangerous for both promoters as well as the recipients of these programs. They often had to alter programs, shift it, change it, and even close it down for periods of time. The 1976 earthquake acted as a detonator for the resurgence of a dormant revolutionary movement, breaking the fragile status quo with the military. The earthquake's physical upheaval led to a social realignment of labor unions, peasant organizations, and guerrilla movements, along with a high conscientization of Guatemalan peasants and indigenous communities. As the revolutionary movement strengthened, so did the state's repression against civilians, both urban and rural, which had been steadily increasing against students, unions, and school teachers. Paramilitary groups, commonly known as death squads, were responsible for kidnapping, detaining, torturing, and killing dozens of people every day. Urban residents woke daily to as many as 20 or 30 bodies dumped on street corners, a stark reminder of what would happen if one acted against state interests. The state's extremely violent response to revolutionary forces and civilians were justified by the Cold War binary worldview that accused anyone of working to change the current political or social system as communists. By the early 1980s, this violence permeated the very fabric of daily life, creating unprecedented levels of psychological terror and uncertainty. The message was clear. No one was immune from the possibility of disappearance. The intense fear created by this amorphous, permeating threat was, of course, the state's intention. Unpredictable violence of this magnitude was intended to sever bonds between people and to create suspicion within every encounter with neighbor and friend. And MCC's foundational tenet of working together through relationship building struck at the very core of the state's intentions. After prolonged periods of violence and terror, it became normalized within all levels of relationships, even after the immediate threat had passed. So deep has this culture permeated Guatemalan society that to this day, people still lean in when sharing stories about this time period. And we're still uncovering stories of this time because it's remained hidden within people's minds and hearts. Within this volatile context, the defining period for urban Mennonites and MCC emerged with the coup of General Efraín Ríos Montt in March 1982, an era known as La Violencia. Moving away from familiar Cold War analogies embedded in and integral to the anti-communist rhetoric, Ríos Montt reframed the political discourse. he transformed it into a religious nationalistic one, urging one and all to bring in a new Guatemala. Positioning himself as a messenger from God, Rios Montt preached that Guatemala could be saved through the redemption of the individual. This eschatological end of days theology was spread through his weekly Sunday evening sermons, which he did in military garb. Under Rios Montt, this violence became directed at the civilian population living within the regions of revolutionary activity, while those within the capital city experienced a reprieve from the violence and terror. The Rios Montt era for rural and mostly indigenous Guatemalans is synonymous with human rights abuses on an unimaginable scale. Determined to defeat the revolutionary movement, he declared in 1982 that the gorilla is the fish, the people are the sea. If you cannot catch the fish, you must drain the sea. During his first month in office, Rios Montt's escalation of scorched earth policy against revolutionary groups and civilians resulted in a higher number of dead and displaced than at any other time during the 36-year war. It stands alone as the deadliest month of the entire Civil War era, with the murder of more than 3,300 people at the hands of their own government. The national terror created by these actions was magnified by the violence of by the nature of the violence. In what became horrifyingly routine, men would be rounded up in villages, tortured and killed in front of their families, sometimes burned alive in their churches. Women and children were raped before being killed, babies thrown into the air and caught on the ends of swords or thrown against rocks. These are the stories this community you are seeing on the screen told us about their lives. Those fortunate to escape the massacres fared little better, as they were forced to wander the mountains, often for days, with little or no food and water, millions finding exile in southern Mexico, as this community did. In addition, more than 1 million men and boys, including many Mennonites, were forced to participate in civil patrols, forced to police and kill members of their own communities, severing communal ties and traumatizing all involved. MCC personnel became witnesses to genocidal violence, and they began to advocate on behalf of indigenous and rural Guatemalans, directly engaging with government officials. MCC's commitment to solidarity and accompaniment embedded personnel within these communities who then bore witness to these atrocities. Their identity as a transnational organization gave MCC the ability to transmit the truth of what was happening, and they passed on accurate information throughout this period, often bringing Guatemalan speakers to the United States and Canada and helping to develop solidarity networks. Among the many people they hid and helped to safely escape the military death squads was Rigoberta Menchú. Her eyewitness account of the atrocities in Ay Rigoberta shattered the global silence on Guatemala, and her work with Guatemalan indigenous people in exile earned her the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992. Urban Guatemalan Mennonites up until this point had largely responded to this political terror by remaining silent. However, the escalation of violence meant that silence no longer guaranteed one's safety, and many people were disappeared, tortured, and murdered for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. More significantly, for these urban Mennonites, Rios Montt's particular brand of Christianity and his Cold War genocide created a theological crisis. They addressed this during a Central American conference in 1984 called Desafío, or Challenge 84. Some within the urban Mennonite community, caught within this vortex of violence, concluded that a new kind of theology, one that addressed their circumstances, had to be developed. To make sense of their crisis in which they were enveloped, they turned to the earliest formation of Anabaptism for inspiration and guidance. While contemporary North American context held little comparative wisdom for the social conditions of Guatemala, 16th century Europe did. As they struggled to contextualize Reformation Anabaptist theology, they found commonalities to their own lives. The complicity between the church and the state, the inequitable economic distributions, the destructive results of war, including the Peasants' War from 1524 to 26, in which 200,000 peasants died, all became the starting point for their theological journey. For Guatemalan Mennonites, theology needed to be developed from an open dialogue amongst themselves to address their particular situation. An attendant of Desafio, Gerald Schlabach, argued that while North American theology promoted the idea that God will provide faithful Christians from will protect faithful Christians from hardship, and that prosperity is a sign of God's blessings, the Bible was written from the perspective of people experiencing poverty and oppression. Those in attendance concluded simply they could no longer remain silent. The urgency of their violent situation called for an active response and a renewed understanding, which was not just the absence of war, but a fundamental restructuring of their society. They believed that Central America demanded from them fundamental answers related not only to eternity, but also to the present situation, or as Gilberto Flores says here, urgent earthly needs. Their analysis held scripture at its center and not the political ideologies prevalent in Guatemala. And it brought them to the conclusion that God is on the side of the poor and the oppressed. As MCC Director Rich Sider noted, God acts to liberate the poor. God acts in history to exalt the poor and oppressed. And if as Guatemalan Anabaptists were truly God's people, they must remain on the side of the poor and oppressed. This new perspective redefined violence from one of traditional war to systematic institutional forms. In other words, war was not just violence that caused suffering, but poverty, hunger, illiteracy, and social inequality. All of these which had created the social crises that had directly led to Guatemala's civil war. This vision of shalom that emerged following the Central American meetings called for a new social and economic world order, new racial relations between the majority indigenous population and minority Spanish speakers, as well as new political relations and new models of nonviolent social action. Well, MCC played a significant role in supporting and facilitating the Central American gathering where people could process their suffering and translate it theologically. These conclusions also marked a significant shift for MCC personnel and programming, supporting and strengthening their work. While the initial approach had been a north-south flow of authority, a traditional missionary approach with skills, funding, and knowledge flowing from the north to the south, Desafio 84 fundamentally altered MCC's position to one of accompaniment and solidarity, embracing and communicating an Anabaptist vision of shalom that included listening and learning from those with whom they worked. And throughout the 1980s, this vision of shalom came to include education around the deep patriarchy embedded in Guatemala, the equality of women, and the growing awareness of racism and foreign privilege amongst Guatemalan and MCC personnel. So you see this very profound shift where they are learning from their context. This vision of shalom, which called for direct political and social engagement, created tensions within the Guatemalan Mennonite community, which included both rural and urban congregations, Spanish speakers and Kaqchi, very poor as well as well-educated and middle class. Its practical implications were complicated by the unequal impacts of war, which potentially put people at risk, and its theological implications challenged the dominant two kingdoms theology practiced amongst some congregations. I can speak more to this if you want in the Q&A. This approach also created tension with MCC constituents, complicated by the polarized context of the Cold War. Their North American constituency was largely enthralled with Ronald Reagan's narrative of the Christian Guatemalan government fighting communists. And the US government had used Reagan's popularity to hide the violence they were overtly funding. Consequently, MCC used stories and personal narratives which could apolitically claim authority and create disruptive narratives to counter Reagan's triumphant anti-communist position and Cold War discourse. Guatemalans and Central Americans were brought to the US and Canada to share their stories of violence and this Anabaptist theological transformation. Their stories disrupted the comfortable security of Cold War deniability, creating an awareness of the complicity of US foreign policy within Central America's violence. As a result, individuals were transformed, and MCC strengthened its presence in Washington, DC, sharing the stories of Guatemalans and Central Americans with those who were making foreign policy. All of these stories were verified in 2005 by the discovery of an old warehouse filled with the political and military archives in Guatemala City. More than 16 million documents revealed that everything that had been shared during this time had in fact been happening, despite Guatemala's denial of these events. MCC's presence as a transnational conduit of accurate information became even more significant in the post-peace accords era of 1996. While the official conflict had ended, the socioeconomic crisis that had sparked it remained unchanged. The military elite were still in power, land reform had not occurred, endemic poverty remained, corruption among the elite was rampant, and now Guatemalan society was traumatized by the extreme violence of the war years. From the point of view of the state, the violence that continued and actually accelerated in the post-peace era was not political and therefore could simply be ignored. That was a social problem, not a state problem. However, the number of murders increased in the years following the peace accords, such that by 2010, more people, more Guatemalans were dying on a daily basis than ever during the war itself. In addition, neoliberal reforms also accelerated during the 1990s, and I can speak more of this if people want, which devastated the fragile and inequitable economy. The cost of living skyrocketed, and by the early 2000s, migration north to the US border, which Jodi can talk about, appeared to be the answer for many Guatemalans. Humanitarian border groups reported that more than half the migrants by 2010 were from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. MCC shifted its programming within this vision of shalom to address the post-accords period. Institutionalizing programs developed during the 1980s, they created networks of education and support, such as Menno, which later became Red Paz, or the Peace Network. Here they advocated against globalization and economic inequality, introducing their vision of shalom, which could bring economic stability as well as social safety to their communities at the very intimate levels. MCC supported the publication of materials, education for Anabaptist leaders and theologians, as well as encouraging the development of a service culture within Guatemalan Mennonite community congregations. I have just touched very briefly on a few things, so let me conclude. Violence lies at the heart of the MCC story in Guatemala, both in why it arrived and its participation in a theological transformation. This vision of shalom, a new heaven and a new earth, directly confronted the socio-political violence and had a powerful and empowering impact on all those living within this violent context. This vision encouraged a reversal of traditional flow of personnel, funds, and knowledge to a south to north trajectory, where we in the north learned from those living in the midst of this process. The MCC context encouraged the transformation of personnel from being experts and dispensers of money and expertise, and by association, power and privilege, to learners and accompaniers, of being in solidarity with those they served. shifting the structure from a hierarchical one to a dialogical relationship, a relationship that was continuously self-reflective of its power and privilege, engaging with and learning from Guatemalans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for your presentation on looking at peace building in Guatemala. And I would like to thank all the speakers and for your presentations and looking at peace building. It is such an important topic and so complex. And we know that peace building requires structural changes. In peace and conflict studies, we talk about scholars such as Galtung, who discusses positive peace, which is more than the absence of war, and addressing structural violence. Another scholar, John Paul Lederach, discusses peace as being embedded in justice, where we are building relationships and social structures, looking at human rights and nonviolence. And I think all of your presentations reflect these different aspects. So thanks to Kim for discussing and looking at the teachings of nonviolence in Zimbabwe and MCC's work and development, as well as the need to address the political structures in order to create social justice. And to Grace for talking about peace institutes and sharing your research on how recipients are now applying their learnings back in their home communities and the importance of such trainings and programs. And to Jodi for your discussion on the importance of listening to marginalized groups, people of color, indigenous, queer, and discussing queer Mennonites, queer theory, and defining violence in different ways. And lastly, to Patricia for your stories and research on the violence and terror experienced by Guatemalans since the aftermath of the 1976 earthquake, and how MCC has created solidarity with the communities in telling the truth of the political terror that have occurred in Guatemala. So all of your presentations have given us a lot to think about. And now I would like to open this up for the Q&A. And if you have questions for the presenters, please put them in the Q&A, and I will ask them of the presenters. So I have a question that was in the chat from Lucille Marr, who couldn't access the Q&A. So this is a question for Kim. Kim, MCC helped build BICC mission schools. Could you say a bit more about how MCC and the BICC have worked together at developing a pedagogy of the oppressed?
Oh, okay. I should preface this by saying people who actually got involved, who got more involved in the spread of this message on the preferential option for the poor, based on the book, were Mennonites or Brethren in Christ from the standpoint of view of, who were Africans largely. And this was something that was very difficult to avoid at that period of time, because there was a lot of teaching around the theme of the oppressed, and hence the Brethren in Christ operatives, if I may use those terms, found themselves, because this resonated with them, with what their needs were at that particular time, which is addressing the question of the poor. It's is as if the initial say preaching or gospel around non-violence really didn't touch their their souls. Not that it wasn't important, but I think to a certain extent they took it to a certain extent for granted, because especially among the developed people, there is this tradition of peace which they actually try to emphasize. So yes, and they did this in collaboration with the Lutheran World Federation, as I said, where the BIC people joined in not only doing that, but also in using some of the textbooks in schools to spread this message about helping the poor. And in the future, I think that's the theme is still going to continue to talk about where God is seen to be on the side of those who are weak and are in need. And is becoming more and more a popular theme. And I think what has actually accentuated that is the fact that some of the people who have been appointed as country representatives come from contexts where some of these issues obtain. And so we find ourselves gravitating towards that situation. I don't know if it answers that question.
Great, thank you, Kim, for that. In the Q&A, this is a question for Grace. Grace, with COVID and Zoom, are there initiatives for the PIs to be done more online? This seems to be a time ripe for opportunity. And this is a question from Merv Forst.
Yes, since COVID became part of our reality last year, most of the PIs have offered training or some sort of programming online since March 2020. So when I did this study in 2019, there was not much interest in that. The feeling was it's not the same. Many folks live in countries without good internet, so there's that exclusionary element. But since then, that has been the only option, and many folks have been able to successfully make that transition. And I will be curious how that will look going forward, if that will become a permanent offering or a complementary element. So we shall see.
Great, thank you. The next question in the Q&A is for Jodi. Thanks for your presentation this morning. You have many experiences with MCC. As you invite MCC to reconsider violence and peace building, I'm curious about your reflections on your time with MCC, including program reviews and how a lens of queer peace building would strengthen or change the work you participated in. And this is from Anna.
Thanks so much for the question. Yeah, one of my hopes today was to look at applying a queer Mennonite peace building lens to some of the work that I did with MCC. And one of the things that I worked on before I left MCC was the Peace Parts Toolkit. This was in 2008, 2009, I believe. And I think an expanded view of understanding who's being harmed. I would have written about peace more, understanding the diversity of identities that are out there. I would try to understand how violence impacts people, how things are written. I think as a person who experiences exclusion, the way that I write about peace is different, the way I write about justice, because I am one who is impacted by that violence. And so I think anytime that we are a person that's impacted by violence, it changes then our views. I think I'd also be able to see how violence impacts people in their homes, in their churches, in a way that I was not familiar with, both in Bolivia and Chile. I think that MCC under a different view would have different kinds of partnerships as well. And to see some of the ways that that other people have experienced violence. I might have come out earlier than just after completing my MCC terms, who knows? And I think there's just the importance of naming violence, of naming exclusion, of naming keeping out of spaces, and also, understanding processes. I run processes as a facilitator, as a teacher, but those processes don't always feel life-giving or justice-giving to people who have experienced the harm. And so I think for me as a peace builder, that's a really important lesson to take with me. So I think those are some things that I would offer that would change me in my work with MCC.
Thank you, Jodi. Our next question in the Q&A is from Robert Enns, and this is for Grace. Thank you, Grace, for the support and mentoring that you provide to peace building in our team in Bangladesh. You mentioned national staff gaining training at peace institutes. What do you believe are the best ways to enable PI trainees to facilitate peace building in their work in places like Bangladesh?
That's a good question. That transition is one we're always looking to improve. I know that a lot of the peace institutes, I'm not sure about the one in Asia where Bangladesh will have sent most of their staff, but many of the peace institutes have a practice where they ask their attendees, their participants, to do an action plan for how they want to apply that information when they go home. So I think that is one very, very good tool. I think another very good tool is for reps and programs to sort of set those expectations early when sending someone to a PI. These are the skills we'd like to get better at. These are the values that we want to build, and this is how we want to use it when you come home. So sort of setting up some of those expectations and ensuring that the experience is useful to the staff and useful to the program at large. And then finally, I would mention, I know Bangladesh and many programs have many staff who are trained in peace building and many staff who are working on peace building work. So finding ways to connect folks to create a support network in country and in the program for the alumni when they come home, so they can continue to share their knowledge with each other and apply that to their workplace. So those are just some ideas, but I would be happy to hear what has worked for others in other countries. And that would be a very interesting follow-up study.
Thanks, Grace. The next question I will ask Patricia, and this is from Irving Peachy. And the question is, did MCC have a working agreement with the government of Guatemala, or what was the legal basis for its presence in the country? This would be a research topic covering MCC historically and present.
Yes, thank you for the question. I have written about this to some extent, although I haven't written about it a lot until very recently, because we needed to protect people who were part of this story, who were still in country and on the ground. That's been one of the issues around doing MCC history in Guatemala, is that there is much that I haven't said and couldn't say for a long time because of the danger it directly put people in. But yes, absolutely. The National Reconstruction Committee in Guatemala, which was formed after the earthquake, which was sort of the national body trying to organize all of the groups that came into the country. Guatemala becomes flooded by mostly Protestant, often very evangelical, Pentecostal groups who come in and not only came in with materials and supplies, but also sort of a missionary zeal. MCC gets invited to create a permanent body in Guatemala by that group, which ironically is headed by the military, and they're actually directly reporting to a military general who, on the one hand, I mean, you can imagine the contradictions here, right? Everything MCC stands for, and this is who they're having to work with, but they decided to work with them in order to do the kind of work they needed to do for ordinary Guatemalans, because at that point, and very much to this present day, to work in Guatemala is to negotiate with the military. There's no way around it, because they are in charge. And so you have to do that. Amazingly, they were able to navigate that terrain. It became very complex under Rios Montt, because members of the Mennonite community knew Rios Montt personally. So you had personal relationships that had been, became highly politicized while he was in power because they were actively working against and trying to out what he was doing. The National Reconstruction Committee also created problems for some of the MCCers from Europe when their home constituents in Europe found out that the people they were sending and supporting were actually working with the military. They were absolutely horrified because they didn't understand the nature of Guatemala. So it was a very difficult relationship. They were often threatened. MCC would attend sort of national meetings that the National Reconstruction Committee would hold with NGOs, where they would remind them that their lives were literally there by the grace of the Guatemalan military. It was very, very overt. So it was a really ironic kind of relationship because their legal basis was there with the NRC, and yet the very work they were doing challenged the authority of the National Reconstruction Committee, the military, the dictatorships that were going on. So a very challenging, but it actually caused everybody within this sphere to really, really analyze their own positions about nonviolence, about how you accompany people. What does solidarity mean? And people were literally writing in the reports, if we die, we know why, right? They were literally knowing they were putting their lives into danger. So thank you for the question. It's very critical. And I often have to kind of skirt quietly around it because of what the implications of that are. Thanks.
Thanks, Patricia. Our next question is from Ed Nice. It's a question for Jodi. Sometimes when we address justice issues today, while acknowledging that we still have work to do, we also look back and say, how could we have believed that? How could we have done that? Are there things that we believe and do today regarding our lack of LGBTQ inclusion that you think we'll look back on someday and wonder about ourselves? If so, do you have an example or two that you can share?
Thanks for the question very much. And one thing that I'm realizing as I'm listening to Patty and Grace and Kim is that the reality of MCC peacebuilding, of being contextual, of being related to the context, right? Grace talks about how, place institutes need to be relevant to the context. Patty talks about the same thing. Kim talks about how when MCCers arrived, they didn't teach nonviolence to white people. So for me, these things, we need to make MCC peacebuilding relevant, and it has been relevant. And LGBT inclusion is relevant in the context today. It's been relevant for years. Martin Rock was the first one who was fired, or his contract not renewed at MCC in 1976. He's written extensively about that, but he is also the one who created Brethren Mennonite Concerns, or BMC, in 1976. That was a long time ago. So we've been working at this inclusion business, or thinking about it, or approaching it for a long time. Perhaps we're going to wonder, why did it take so long? Are we going to be able to really see how relevant it is to have people working together, right? The whole idea of queering Anabaptist theology is that you have people together to talk about their experience. I think peacebuilding also has people talking about their experience, and queering that, and seeing beyond the binary, seeing beyond the particular categories that we have, and seeing how people are impacted, and not just the people that are kind of like us. So that's my invitation today. And so thanks, Ed, for inviting that.
Thank you, Jodi, for your response. Here is another question. I think it's for everyone. Much of this research has been presented through the lens of justice and violence. Do any of the panelists have thoughts about how MCC's particular Christian lens impacts our view and understanding of peace building versus secular organizations? And how does working in the name of Christ shape this work? So maybe I'll ask Kim to respond to that first, and then anyone else can add to that. Kim?
So, well, I think working in the name of Christ, in the Zimbabwean context, I'm glad Jodi has raised that issue of context, and of course, all the speakers did. For some Zimbabweans, the term was seen as being overused. One has to understand this within the context that in Zimbabwe, over 95% of schools during colonial times and a little beyond colonial times were run by missions. So in the name of Christ was something that they had on a daily basis. So to also meet that one being used, they thought sometimes that it was sloganeering. It's now beyond that. It meant to try to be used as a fig leaf in this context of trying to have people not participate in the struggle for their liberation. So that was a term that was understood and it was taken for granted, but when it was used over and over, it became a little bit tiresome to many people and was seen as just as a slogan that had nothing to do with the practicalities of life. And there were some people who were generating some writings. For instance, the former president of Zimbabwe, the first black president of Zimbabwe, at the time when we had prime minister, Karen Banana, wrote a book on the which was entitled the Gospel According to the Ghetto. And you had quite a number of books that were written around that time, around those themes. So it was seen as something that actually drew a red herring away from what was contextually important as far as these people were concerned.
Thank you, Kim. Patricia, Jodi, or Grace, do you want to add to the response?
Yeah, something I think that MCC and Mennonite peace theology bring to peace building that is very meaningful is the idea of like faith is experienced in community. And I think that translates very well to our peace building in terms of peace is experienced in community. It's not an individual discipline. It's not necessarily always a national discipline. It's something you experience together. I think that's a very healthy contribution. I think the idea of shalom, which can also be called positive peace, is another very meaningful contribution that I've seen work really well when I engage with peace partners. But of course, as has been described on this panel, faith can also be used in a way that's harmful and causes harm. So that's something we hold. Yeah, that's a difficult complexity that we work with. But there are some elements that I think are very meaningful and have contributed to how we teach peace and understand peace.
Great, thank you. Okay, Patricia or Jodi, do you want to add to that? Or are you good? Okay.
Just to build on what Grace was saying, I think what MCC was constantly working to develop was this sense of relationship building, actively, because it actively challenged the state's attempt to just destroy communalism on any level, both indigenous, Guatemalan, urban, in any identity you wanted to say. Their intent was to create individual terrorized people that couldn't act, right? The way in which MCC fostered and facilitated relationships really worked against that. And I think it brought a sense of empowerment to people and a place of, I don't want to minimize this at all, but this is what I know from my relationships with people in Guatemala, a place of safety where they could be safe, at least with each other, and find a sense of trust to ask the terribly hard questions that they had of themselves and of just theological formation in general. to have that space in which to do that really really mattered. So I see that as a really critical lens that MCC brought with them that might be different than a secular organization, as well as then the transnational sort of supranational identity that then allows these very deep and hard questions to become a global set of questions, right? We all become influenced by that. I mean, this is what I grew up with. This is why I became a historian of Latin America, because of MCC and Central America, and the stories I heard. So, you know, that ability to then transmit these things really changes the story from a secular organization to some extent. Jodi, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. I have another question here in the Q&A, and I think there are a couple on the chats I'll get to. This question is from Gregory Vanderbilt, and this is for Grace. As an MCCer in Indonesia, I saw the enthusiasm and inspiration many friends took to and brought back from Menno. So much so that and ethnically, religiously, and geographically diverse groups are working on establishing an Indonesian Peace Institute in order to be accessible to a much broader audience and to do it in Indonesian language, since using English is a barrier for many. How do the PIs you have studied approach the issue of translation, both of the language they are using and of the context that they are bridging? How do they approach religious diversity and interreligious solidarity?
This is a great question. I'm also a fan of Mindanao Peace Institute, MPI. So some things that came to mind are Mindanao Peacebuilding Institute, the one in the Philippines. MCC has sent a lot of folks there from Indonesia, and one of their practices has been to send a translator. They would send a cohort of folks, and they would send a translator with them. So that was one way to work around language issues. Not the same, but it was able to work for the most part. Some of the other peace institutes, particularly in Africa, are just bilingual. They are all French and English, and that's just built into the model. Others will offer translation as needed, so like the earpiece model. As we have transitioned to Zoom, that has opened up more language possibilities as that's built into the technology. So that's been, I don't know if anyone's used that, but that is an option. But this would also, to me, be a situation of where maybe one of those complementary models would be better, of sending a trainer to that context, identifying a trainer in that context. If there are a lot of folks who would benefit in a language that is not English, French, or Spanish. But language or translation has always been a bit of a struggle and has had an exclusionary impact in some parts of the world as well. And yeah, most of the peace institutes do very much have a strong interfaith identity that's part of many of the peace institutes, and to identify those common values that are within every language, every religion, that can be lifted up, that sort of that may transcend some of our other theological differences. That has been a strong part of many peace institutes, but it is also sometimes a long journey to get there.
Thank you, Grace. And I think the importance of language and being able to do these trainings in the languages of the people is so important, because language doesn't translate very well. And I think if you can get the local people to do the trainings because they speak the language. So for example, I have been invited to Laos or Thailand to do workshops on peace building and conflict resolution. Well, I speak the languages. And so that just makes it a lot easier to connect with people there. Okay. I'm just going to look in the chat here, and this one is from Darlene Bartha. Love to hear more from Jodi. Do you see the MCC moving more in favor of inclusion for queer people and queer staff? Do we see this as part of our non-discrimination, caring for the oppressed values?
Thanks, Darlene. My proposal here is for for MCC to look at queer peace building, to look at who's being left out of the picture when they're working in situations of violence, for peace builders to see what's missing, for peace builders to recognize different identities and different kinds of violence. My hope is that from such a study, from such an awareness, as people move both in North America within their own communities and overseas, that translates into something different. Whoa, well, so if these are people that are important in other contexts, could they also be important working within MCC? Are we missing something by not including the voices of queer people, by not understanding the power of our words and policies to keep some people out? So my invitation is one for peace builders, because that's the area that I'm most familiar with. And I feel like there have been a lot of HR conversations over the years. I haven't been aware of them completely, but heard about them, and think that queer Mennonite peace building is a way that we can take it forward as a proposal rather than as a proposal to make forward. So that's my vision, and I think that the caring for the oppressed and examining and understanding our power are key parts of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Jodi. I just want to read a number of things in the chats in the last couple of minutes, unless others have more questions. So I see here Urbane Peachy says that these issues are relevant to all countries in which MCC worked, past and present. And from Cheryl Pauls, thanks for 4 very fine papers that call us forward. Daryl Lowen says, thanks for these important presentations. Patrick Obond says, thanks, great presentations. And Mervyn said that technology can also save fossil fuel, talking about online kinds of sessions like we are doing for this conference today. We're not traveling across the world to attend and to present. Helen Workington says, thank you for all the presenters for taking us out of our privileged comfort zones. And yeah, great presentations, everyone. Thanks, from Carrie Sander Harvey. And Robert Enns says, thank you, Carrie. I'm not aware of that. I'll be interested in learning more about the attempt to create a PI in Bangladesh. So those were some of the comments in the chats. So I would like to thank everyone who presented in the session this morning, and I would like to thank the attendees for your questions and participation in this session. I think the presenters and these topics have given all of us a lot to think about in terms of looking at relationship building, in terms of human rights and nonviolence, and how do we address some of the structural kinds of violence to include voices of marginalized peoples around the world. And so I think you've given us a lot to think about. I know that we have a coffee break coming up between 10 and 10:30, and I hope that you will all return for the next session on MCC and identity formation starting at 10:30. So I think I will, if there aren't any more questions, I will end the session and we can go for coffee, and I will see you all back here at 10:30 for the next session. So thank you everyone for the discussions. Thank you.